Good morning, friends. Welcome to the Spring Cloud Session 7. Thank you for watching my earlier sessions. In this session, we are going to primarily focus on centralized configurations. So what is meant by centralized configuration? Why do we need that? Okay. So that is what we are going to cover in this session. So you might be seeing multiple microservices in this session. If you don't understand what their role they play, please watch my earlier sessions. You will understand that entire microservice landscape. Okay, in this session, we primarily focus on what is configuration server. So you have noticed, right? Roughly, we have 5 to 6 microservices. So each and every microservice has its own configuration. And if you want to change configuration in a microservice, you have to go to that microservice and change the configuration. So which is not a right way. So because you as your microservices grow, then each and every microservice has its own configuration, then it will be very difficult for you to understand what is the common configuration across these microservices. Okay, if you make any change, what's the impact it is going to create on other microservice. So to address this need, Spring came up with a centralized configuration server. So all the configurations, all the microservices configurations are saved in one configuration server that is called Spring Cloud Config Server. So in this session, you are going to understand what is a Spring Cloud Config Server and Spring Cloud Config Client and things around that. So the name says centralized means there will be only one config server. I mean, for a resiliency sake, we can run multiple configuration servers. That's I'm not going to say. But in this session, what we are going to run, we are going to run one centralized config server. And every time when a microservices comes up, it's going to take its configurations from the configuration server and starts up. So that is what we are going to say. So our standard employee report application, we know that our microservices is like it just gives an employee report by taking employee ID. A report contains employee name and his salary information. So, and also I demonstrated synchronous, asynchronous. Okay, if you watch my previous videos, you understand. So we are going to see how to start a centralized. Before going that, okay, first of all, what is a configuration server? The role of configuration server is to serve configurations. That's all. So it's simply a Spring Boot application which serves configurations of other applications. Like we have other microservices. Those configurations are managed by this configuration server. Then why do we need a configuration server? As I said, right? So when your microservices grows, then it's really difficult for you to understand what are the configurations they have, how do you manage those configurations and stuff. So having a centralized configuration server is a right way in the landscape of microservices. So here we are going to see Spring Cloud Config Server. Ideally, the configurations are stored in a repository. Repository, I mean, it can be a Git, it can be a database. So when you make change to a particular configuration, then automatically the microservice is going to sync and apply those configurations. So automatically those configurations are applied by the microservice. For this demo sake, the configurations are stored on the file system. So the Spring Cloud Config Server is going to read configurations from the file system, not from the Git repository. So the entire session, what I'm going to deal, will read the configurations from the file system. Okay, so let's go on to the whiteboard and understand the architecture. Then we will do a small demo, and yeah, that's the plan. So if you go to the whiteboard, right, then we have the config server. The heart is this. So the config server, when it starts, it's occupied 8888 port. So this is occupying a static port 8888 48. So when gateway comes up, it reads its configuration from config server. When report API comes up, it reads even registry, the service registry. When it comes up, It's going to read its configurations from config server. Every microservice, when it comes up, they are going to read configurations from config server. Then you might be asking, is if the config server goes down, then what is the stake? So those scenarios we are not going to cover here, but that's a very valid question. So if a config server is down, then you cannot start any of the microservice. So uh, someone might be asking me question, okay, so is it service registry should be first or config server should be first? Okay, those are also trade-off which we will discuss later after completion of all the sessions. Okay, do remember in mind, now first we are going to start config server first, which has all the configurations of all the microservices. Then each and every microservice comes up and reads the configurations from the config server. Okay, that's all. I'm not going to deal about the request flow. So as simple is like the browser calls gateway, a report comes, synchronous calls. These all things you know in my previous session. But the main focus here is like the config server. When a config server comes up, all the microservices read configurations from the config server. So let us do a short demo. Then we are going to see config server and config clients and what you need to do to make your microservice a config client and stuff. Now, as usual, this entire tutorial, what you are seeing is well documented in my GitHub repository. You can clone Spring Cloud Session microservices centralized configuration. You can clone this repository and you can go through the source code and you can play with this, whatever item mode is there in this. Now, I started RabbitMQ and Sleuth. For tracing, I use those servers. So this is an extension of my previous 6 session to store configurations in a config place. That's the reason I'm running RabbitMQ and Sleuth. Ideally, you don't need them, but I want to show the real world or most complex scenario. That's the reason I'm running them. Okay, so I'm running them. If you let me explain, even if someone. So I cloned the GitHub repo here, and what you need to do is we need to do vagrant up. Vagrant up brings one virtual machine which has RabbitMQ and Zipkin servers running on them. So I'm already running it. I want to vagrant up. If you clone, I run RabbitMQ and Sleuth on those. For this tutorial, you really need not to know that because I have a landscape of microservices. I'm using it. Now I do vagrant. I don't need vagrant up. I already brought them up. Vagrant SSH. Okay. So I'm taking SSH to my Linux box. I don't know why it is taking time. Sure. Then let me switch to root. Then I'll go to vagrant folder. This is the folder where the entire cd vagrant. This is a folder where I have the cloned Git repo. So when you bring the virtual machine up, it will mount the cloned project or current working directory, what it is running. So it cloned and you can see all the things. So I'm going to bring a RabbitMQ and Jenkins servers here in the Docker. So if you see, this is what the RabbitMQ and Jenkins server. So if you see my previous tutorial, you understood that. The simple way to do it is docker -compose up -t runs Zipkin and RabbitMQ in a detached mode. Okay, that's what docker compose up. I'm already running them. I'm not going to run them. So docker compose ps, it shows these two services are up. If you don't know RabbitMQ and Zipkin, don't worry. It's just I used to trace the call flow. So now the first essential thing what we do is when you get the code, we as usual we do maven clean install, right? So let me build the code because the source code repository doesn't have the artifacts. So I'm just doing maven clean install. So the necessary artifacts are built. See, the number of microservices are going day by day. Now we have config server. Now let me bring the config server is the first one which you need to bring, right? So let me bring the config server up. So Java jar, the standard pattern config server.jar. So this is how we will bring our config server first. So the configuration server comes up, it binds to port 48. That is the default port it binds. So it took 20 seconds for the config server to come up, and it binded to the profile. You pay attention to this one thing, the native. It is not using default profile. I said use native profile. In the native profile, I defined that take the configurations from the file system. So when the config server comes up, it has to know the configurations of all the microservices, right? It takes it from the file system. That is what the profile native. I'm not running in a default profile. So that's one thing you need to do, and it is binded to default 488888 port. Now let me bring the registry up. So when you bring the registry up, the registry has to know where the config server is up and take all the configurations from the config server. So if you see here, it identified config server is running on 8888. It is contacting the config server, taking the configurations, okay, and bringing the service registry up. So let's wait for some more time for the service registry to up. So the service registry is up. That's all. Now we will start one by one all our microservices, employee, then payroll. Okay, so let those microservices up. So each and every time when a microservice becomes up, it's going to fetch the configurations from the config server. Okay, so how a microservice is going to get configuration from config server? Using config server's REST API. So that I'm going to show you. Now let us see. This employee microservice is up, right? It has to know the details, right? How it is going to get? It is going to call. I have, you see here, 888 is the port on which the config server is listening. So config server, if you call with the microservice name / profile, gives you the configurations associated to it. Now let us see. This is an employee microservice. Okay, so these are the properties of the employee microservice. That's simple it all. Anyhow, when I walk you through the code, you will understand. But essentially, what you need to understand is every microservice uses REST API of config server and gets its configurations. That's all. Now the employee payroll is up. Let us bring the report API up. Okay. Similarly, we'll bring the mail client up. So every time the mail client is contacting the config server, similarly the report API is contacting config server. Okay, let us call the gateway also up. So now we have all the services up, and let's take some time for them to settle. So let us go and understand the config server configurations and the client, and then we will do a short request call and see whether the microservices are working fine or not. Okay, first important thing is like the config server. So you should be asking me, let us see the pom.xml. So if you want to have a config server, the simple dependency which you need to add is these two: Spring Cloud config server and Spring retry. It is a simple Spring Boot application, and you need to have these two things: Spring Cloud config server and Spring retry. If you have this dependency, then your Spring Boot application becomes config server. And the next annotation, what you need to is enable config server. That's all. You need to enable it's a Spring Boot application, and you are making it as a config server. And let us see the application.yml. So this we are saying to run it on 888, and the default profile, I'm saying it as a native. Okay, I'm saying it as a native, and it is a config server, and the search location I have is .conf in current working directory where the microservices are running. You have the repo here. So if you closely pay attention to the config repo folder, right? This is an important thing for you to understand. Config repo folder, where we are storing all our configurations. So the application.yml has the common configurations across all the services. Like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 microservices. All the 6 microservices, the common configurations, I place it in application.yml. That is what you know. So the log or the trace mechanism, what we have, right? Those are common across all the microservices. So I'm moving them into the application.yml. That is what it says. Okay, write log information to RabbitMQ, trace information to RabbitMQ, and for every trace ID. So that is what the application.yml. Now let me show you the employee API. So this is the employee API application. So this is an application name, and this is, remember that this is a default profile of employee API. So employee API icon default. So as employee API.yml file. So the employee API default profile, we are storing it in the employee API. Similarly, the gateway, these are all things you know. So essentially, this is like each and every configurations of a microservice. So if you want to get the employee API configurations, the config server has a REST API. If you say employee API/default, it is going to give you the default profile. Okay, so that is what it is doing. It is giving the default profile. It's the same thing for the report API also. So if I call report API is slightly complex, right? So it has so many configurations. You are going to fetch them. Now that's about the config server. So the config server, you need to have enable config server and application.yml, which says the config server. Config server, config repo, you know. Now the client. So I'll show you only the one example of employee API. The same thing. What you have to do is, right, you need to have Spring Cloud starter config. Okay, so this is your dependency. So as a configuration client, you need to have this dependency and this retry. These two things you need to have. And one important thing which you need to remember is like bootstrap.yml. So it's very common in the Spring Boot, you have application.yml, right? So now we'll call it a bootstrap.yml. When you have bootstrap.yml, then when Spring Cloud config server comes up, it reads where is a config server configuration. We are saying that config server is on the local host and the URL is 48. So, and it says how many times it needs to retry and stuff. So this is common across all the microservices. Like now every microservice will have the same configuration, and this is the microservice name, and it will show where is the config server. So every microservice which comes up, you have seen that it is going to call config server and read the configurations. So that makes life very simple. One place we have all the configurations. There is one configuration server, and we have all the config clients. That's all. So let me get the employee details to see that everything is working fine or not. Let me do one just curl call. So this will give the employee details with an employee name 100. So where everything happens, you'll see here the whole flow, you know it, right? Where it will make a sync call, RabbitMQ, then Spring Sleuth. So many things were there. So remember, forgot about everything. What you need to know in this session is like there is a config server. Every microservice register itself with the config server and gets the configurations. Sorry, I shouldn't say register. Every microservice will get configurations from the config server. There is a registry as well, dynamic ports, all the 6 sessions plus configurations. Nothing complex about it. Okay, so I think I pretty much covered everything. Config server, file system. Yeah, I walked you through the code as well. pom.xml and everything. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. So thank you for watching. So play with the code which is in the GitHub repo, and if you have any questions, drop us a note. Thank you very much.